The Incorrigible Escaper, June 17, 1941, near Tobruk, Libya. Lieutenant Alastair Cram of the British Royal Artillery watched German panzers emerge through the heat shimmer, their guns swivelling toward his exposed position. Operation Battle Axe, Britain's attempt to relieve besieged Tobruk, was collapsing. Cram's battery had fired until their ammunition ran dry, turned their guns into scrap metal, and now faced the inevitable. German infantry surrounded them, rifles raised. Cram raised his hands. The war on the front lines ended, but something ignited inside him, a fundamental refusal to accept his captivity. For Alastair Cram, being a POW was not a sentence to endure, but an insult to escape. The German Feldwebel who processed him noted his name, rank, and serial number. 26, average height, sandy-haired. Nothing distinguished Cram from the hundreds of other prisoners, but behind his unremarkable features churned a mind that would not accept captivity. Within hours, while others slumped in shock, Cram studied the wire perimeter. He noted guard rotations and measured distances with his eyes. The Germans handed their British prisoners to the Italians the next morning. The handover was perfunctory, almost dismissive. Italy's North African forces treated the British with a mixture of professional respect and visible frustration. These were the men who had humiliated them at Bader Fomm. Though roles were now reversed, neither side forgot. The journey north to the transit camps was a nightmarish blur of cattle cars and guarded marches. 3 days were spent locked in a sweltering freight car with 60 men, a single bucket for waste, and water distributed once daily. The stench became overpowering. Cram noted everything: frequent stops, casual guards, the exposed hinges on the padlocked doors. At the first major stop, while prisoners shuffled toward latrines, Cram slipped away. He made it perhaps 200 yards before Italian carabinieri tackled him into the sand. They beat him with rifle butts hard enough to make the point before throwing him back into the car. Fellow prisoners stared, some with admiration, others with resentment. His escape attempt had cost them their water ration. The transit camp at Benghazi was humanity compressed into wire and concrete. Thousands of British and Commonwealth prisoners occupied a former barracks surrounded by double fences and guard towers. The Italians ran the camp with a bureaucratic precision that made the deprivation worse, with twice-daily roll calls and punishment for the slightest infraction administered without anger or mercy. Cram spent his first week mapping every detail: the latrine's position, the guards' 4-hour rotations, the old rusted wire near the cookhouse. He recruited 2 officers, convinced them escape was possible through the latrine drainage tunnel. They tried on a moonless July night. The tunnel was a concrete pipe flowing with raw sewage, barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. Cram went first, clawing through 20 yards of filth into a drainage ditch outside the wire. As he sucked in clean air, spotlights blazed and guards materialized. They had known about the tunnel for months. It was a trap to identify troublemakers. This time, the beating was methodical. The carabinieri took Cram to a windowless concrete building. They stripped him, making him stand for hours while questioning him in broken English. To questions of who planned the escape or who had tools, Cram gave nothing but his name, rank, and serial number. They struck him with batons on the kidneys, back, and legs. When he collapsed, they threw water on him and made him stand again. After 6 hours, they gave up. His reputation crystallized, the British lieutenant who would not submit. The Italians transferred him to Campo 21 at Chieti, a larger permanent camp in central Italy. The journey took 2 weeks, a cattle car odyssey across the Mediterranean by ship, then rail. Cram tried to escape from the ship by slipping over the side at night, but was fished out of Naples harbour, hypothermic and furious. At Chieti, he organised 3 more escapes in 4 months, cutting fence wire during a storm, caught, forging papers to walk out with a work detail, caught, and tunnelling from a barracks floor for 6 weeks, only for guards to find it the day before completion. Each recapture brought harsher punishment, solitary confinement in cells so small he could touch both walls, and reduced rations of thin soup and mouldy bread. The camp commandant, a weary colonel named Vicedomini, finally summoned Cram. Vicedomini, who spoke excellent English from his time at Cambridge, regarded Cram with exasperated respect. "Tenente, you are wasting your time and mine. Every escape attempt fails, and your fellow prisoners suffer for it. Why do you persist?" Cram met his gaze. "Because I'm a British officer, sir. It's my duty." Vicedomini shook his head. "Duty? You British cling to this word like a talisman. Very well. Since you find our hospitality so disagreeable, we will transfer you somewhere more suitable to your temperament." By early 1942, Cram's file was thick with escape attempts and exasperated notes from commandants. The Italian Ministry of War maintained a special list of incorrigible prisoners whose pathological determination to escape made them liabilities at standard camps. These men required special handling, and the Italians had the place for them. The orders came in March. Transfer to Campo 5, Gavi. The name meant nothing to Cram, but prisoners who heard his destination fell silent. An Australian captain, transferred from Gavi for a medical issue, pulled Cram aside. "Mate, you've earned yourself a berth in hell." Gavi's a medieval fortress on a mountain peak, walls 40 feet thick, guards everywhere. They put it there for blokes like you. No one's ever gotten out. The journey to Gavi began on another train, under heavy guard. 8 Italian soldiers accompanied 24 officers, all with extensive escape records. The men spoke little. They understood they were the British Army's most stubborn spirits, now being removed from circulation. The train wound north into the Ligurian mountains, the landscape transforming into steep gorges. The temperature dropped. At a small mountain station, guards marched them onto trucks. The road twisted upward in a series of switchbacks, the trucks grinding in low gear as Cram glimpsed vertical drops through the canvas. The fortress appeared suddenly as the trucks rounded a final curve, a massive stone structure perched on a mountain peak. Gavi was built in the 17th century, its walls rising from cliff faces, buttressed with sloping ramparts that made scaling impossible. A single road approached the main gate, exposed to fire from multiple towers. The truck stopped, guards ordered the prisoners out, and Cram's first breath of mountain air bit his lungs. Thin, cold, smelling of pine and ancient stone. The iron gates groaned open. They entered a different era, a courtyard of worn cobblestones, surrounded by stone buildings with barred windows. Everything was stone. Walls, floors, arches, stairs. The fortress seemed carved from the mountain itself. The prisoners were herded into a processing room where each man was photographed, fingerprinted, and catalogued. The camp commandant, Colonel Mazzarelli, addressed them through an interpreter. "Gentlemen, welcome to Gavi. This fortress has stood for 300 years, never breached by force, never escaped from by cunning. You are here because you refused to accept captivity elsewhere. Here, reality is absolute. Any escape attempt will result in solitary confinement. Any damage to property will result in court-martial. Any violence toward guards will result in execution. Behave as officers, and you will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Behave as criminals, and you will be treated as such." The cells were stone chambers carved into the fortress walls, 8 feet square with a barred window over an impossible drop. Crams faced north toward snow-capped peaks. The oak door, reinforced with iron, locked with a clank like medieval hardware. The furniture was a wooden board for sleeping, a bucket, and a table. The single blanket was threadbare. A penetrating chill seeped from the stone constantly. That first night, Cram stood at his window, looking at the mountains stretching to the horizon. The fortress crowned an isolated peak, the land falling away into forests and valleys. No roads approached except their own. No cover existed for miles. Even if a man got over the walls, survived the drop, and reached the forest, Italian patrols would hunt him through terrain they knew intimately. The daily routine at Gavi was calculated to break spirits through monotony. Roll call at dawn had prisoners assembled in the courtyard regardless of weather, the mountain wind cutting through their uniforms. Breakfast was ersatz coffee and weapon-hard bread. Midday brought watery soup, and evening more bread. The prisoners existed in perpetual hunger, but hunger was secondary to the cold radiating from the stone walls, which had been designed for defense, not comfort, turning cells into refrigerators. Prisoners wore every piece of clothing they owned and still shivered through the nights. Frostbite and pneumonia were constant threats. The camp hospital, staffed by detached Italian doctors, dispensed minimal care with maximum bureaucracy. Cram contracted bronchitis, spending 4 days coughing until his ribs ached. Yet even in this fortress designed to extinguish hope, Cram refused to surrender. He studied the thinly spread night watch. He examined the walls for handholds. He befriended other prisoners, learning their skills. A locksmith, an engineer, speaking in whispers during exercise periods. The Australian had been right. No one had escaped from Gavi. But Cram understood something the Italians hadn't counted on. The fortress was designed to contain men attempting conventional escapes. He was beginning to realize that the only way out would require something so extreme, so unprecedented, that the Italians would never anticipate it. Something that would require him to do the unthinkable to his own body. The idea was forming, still nebulous, still insane. In the deep cold of his stone cell, listening to the mountain wind howl, Alastair Cram began to contemplate an escape that would horrify the Italian doctors when they finally understood what he had done. The inescapable fortress, late 1942, Campo PG5, Gavi, Italy. When Lieutenant Alastair Cram first saw Gavi Fortress, he understood its reputation. Carved from solid rock, with sheer drops on all sides and a single heavily guarded causeway, it was the Italian equivalent of Colditz. The psychological weight of the place was immense. The prisoners, mostly high-risk escaper officers like himself, were trapped in a state of suspended animation. The thick stone walls didn't just hold their bodies, they smothered their spirits. Cram tried to formulate a plan, but tunnels were impossible in solid rock, and the walls were unclimbable. For the first time, he felt a flicker of despair, watching fellow officers succumb to barbed wire disease. Physical escape seemed impossible. He realized that if he couldn't break out of the fortress, he would have to find a way to make it eject him. The first morning roll call established the rhythm of existence. At 0600 hours, Italian guards hammered rifle butts against cell doors, the sound a metallic thunderclap ricocheting through stone corridors. Cram stood with 40 other British officers in the central courtyard, the December cold seeping through his threadbare uniform. The stones beneath his feet were slick with frost. The Italian commandant, Colonnello Visconti, walked the line with theatrical slowness, his breath clouding in the mountain air. Stopping before Cram, he studied the lieutenant's file with exaggerated interest. 5 previous escape attempts from 3 different camps, a dangerous man requiring special attention. Visconti tapped the file against his palm. "Lieutenant Cram," he said in precise English, "you will find Gavi different. The Rock remembers everyone who has tried to leave. All of them are still here." The guards laughed. Cram kept his eyes fixed on the wall across the courtyard, counting windows, measuring distances, cataloguing details that might prove useful. Work detail began at 0700. Prisoners were marched down narrow stone staircases to the fortress's lower levels to maintain the facility. Cram was assigned to the infirmary crew, scrubbing floors and emptying waste buckets. The Italian medical officer, Capitano Dottore Rossini, oversaw morning inspections with professional detachment. He was younger than most camp doctors, perhaps 35, with careful hands and a methodical approach. Cram watched him conduct sick parade, noting how Rossini documented everything, symptoms, treatments, weights, in a leather-bound register. The doctor took his work seriously. When Private Miller reported with frostbitten toes, Rossini spent 20 minutes examining the damage, marking observations in his precise handwriting. The infirmary smelled of carbolic acid and damp stone. Through the barred windows, Cram glimpsed the valley 1,000 feet below. The windows were too narrow for a man to pass through, but he filed away the layout of the medical wing, the location of supplies, and the doctor's routine. The noon meal arrived in metal containers, watery soup of turnips and potato peelings, and a slice of dark bread that crumbled between the fingers. Cram had eaten worse in the western desert, but the portions here were calculated to maintain life without providing strength. He was down to 12 stone, from 14 when captured 8 months earlier. His uniform hung loose on his once muscular shoulders. Around him, other officers exhibited the same hollowed features and deliberate, energy-conserving movements. Major Harrison, captured at Tobruk, had developed a tremor from vitamin deficiency. Lieutenant Patterson's teeth were loosening from scurvy. The body consumed itself here, burning fat and muscle to stay alive in the mountain cold. By the 3rd week, Cram knew every face in his cell block. Captain David Sterling, founder of the SAS, occupied the adjacent cell. A prize capture, Sterling spent his days exercising, refusing to let confinement weaken him. Yet Cram noticed the SAS captain had stopped discussing escape. The fortress had done its work. In the courtyard, Sterling moved with mechanical precision, his mind somewhere else. He had been at Gavi for 7 months. The Rock was winning. Lieutenant Commander Hugo Bracken, Royal Navy, provided a different model of resistance. Captured when his submarine was sunk, Bracken had adapted by becoming the camp's unofficial quartermaster, trading cigarettes for extra rations, warmer blankets and books. He knew which guards could be bribed. During one exercise period, Bracken sidled next to Cram. "You're the one who walked out of Campo 21 dressed as a carabiniere," he said without looking at him. Cram nodded. "Won't work here," Bracken continued. "The Italians rotate guards every 72 hours. No one knows the faces. I've watched for 6 months." He produced a treasured stub of pencil. "But I've mapped every guard rotation. If you're planning something, I can tell you when the causeway has minimum coverage. Not that it matters. They'd see you before you crossed halfway." The information cost Cram 2 cigarettes from his Red Cross parcel, the currency of camp life. He added it to his growing mental catalogue. Guard rotations, supply deliveries, doctor's rounds, meal times. He was assembling data without knowing what pattern might emerge. After 2 months, death became routine. Lieutenant Geoffrey Morris succumbed to pneumonia in late January. The Italian doctor worked frantically, but the combination of poor nutrition and the fortress's brutal cold was too much. Morris died in the infirmary. In the morning, his body, covered by a blanket, was carried down the causeway on a stretcher. The prisoners stood at attention as the Italians performed a brief ceremony, firing a salute that echoed off the stone. Colonnello Visconti delivered remarks on the honourable conduct of the deceased before the stretcher disappeared toward the village cemetery. At evening roll call, 1 fewer man stood in the formation. The gap closed. The next morning, Morris's cell had a new occupant. Life continued. Cram realized he had stopped feeling the full weight of death, a numbness that frightened him more than grief. The psychological weight imposed a peculiar temporal distortion, blending days into an undifferentiated mass. Cram marked time by guard rotations, Red Cross parcels, and the slow progression of winter. He developed routines to maintain sanity. 50 push-ups each morning, mental arithmetic during work, memorizing poetry at night. He saw other men fragment. Captain Reeves spent hours whispering to photographs of his children. Lieutenant Shaw convinced himself the war was over. During medical inspections, Capitano Rossini noted these deteriorations in his register, prescribing what treatments his limited supplies allowed. 3 months into his confinement, Cram had his own crisis. During infirmary detail, he dropped a bucket of wash water. The crash brought guards running. Cram stood frozen, staring at the spreading water, and felt something crack inside him. The absurdity of his situation was overwhelming. He was a 32-year-old soldier, and his entire existence had been reduced to scrubbing floors in an ancient fortress. The war raged on somewhere else, but he might as well be on the moon. He had studied every inch of the fortress and found no weakness. There was no way out. He would either die here or survive until the war ended, equally meaningless outcomes. For the first time since his capture, Alastair Cram felt the ice of despair in his chest. That afternoon changed everything. During sick parade, Rossini examined a new arrival, a lieutenant with a stomach complaint. The doctor palpated the man's abdomen, asked detailed questions, and made extensive notes. Cram, scrubbing the floor nearby, heard fragments. Rossini spoke to his assistant. Acute appendicitis. He requires surgery immediately, but we lack facilities. He must be transferred to the military hospital in Milan within 24 hours, or we risk peritonitis. The assistant hurried off to arrange transport as Rossini meticulously documented his findings. Cram's hands paused. A thought formed with crystalline clarity. The fortress was impregnable from within. No tunnel could pierce rock. No disguise would bypass the guards. No force could scale the walls. But there was one doorway the fortress couldn't close: medical necessity. When a prisoner required treatment beyond the camp's capabilities, the Italians had to transfer him. As signatories to the Geneva Convention, they took their medical obligations seriously, evidenced by Rossini's own careful protocols. A prisoner sick enough, injured enough, damaged enough to require external hospitalization had to be taken out. He watched the lieutenant being helped to his cell, bent in pain. Within 2 hours, an ambulance arrived. Guards escorted the sick man on a stretcher down the causeway. From the courtyard, Cram noted the minimal security. A man ill enough for hospitalization posed no escape risk. The Italians were practical. That night, Cram explored the thought systematically. A medical transfer meant leaving Gavi for a hospital, a facility not designed as a high-security prison. The possibilities expanded exponentially, but the transfer required legitimate medical necessity, something Rossini couldn't treat, something serious enough for immediate evacuation, yet not immediately fatal. The idea that crystallized made him physically cold. There was a medical condition he could create himself, one requiring external surgery, one impossible to fake, yet entirely under his control. He would need to damage his own body deliberately, systematically, severely enough to necessitate transfer, but precisely enough to remain survivable. He thought of his officer school medical training, the anatomy lectures, first aid courses. He considered what tools might be available, what methods might work, what timing would be necessary. In the darkness of his cell, Alastair Cram began planning an escape unlike any before. Not over walls or through tunnels, but through the one door the fortress had to open. He would make his body the key. The fortress would eject him because keeping him would become medically impossible. He didn't yet know the precise injury or how he would inflict it. Those details required careful thought, medical knowledge, and an understanding of symptoms. But the path had revealed itself. Physical escape was impossible. Medical necessity was not. For the first time in months, he felt something other than despair. The rock had become conquerable. He simply had to pay the price in flesh. The spark of a terrible idea. Winter 1942, Gavi Fortress. Stretcher-bearers moved across the frozen exercise yard, their boots crunching on the ice. Lieutenant Alastair Cram stood motionless against the stone wall, watching them carry Captain Henderson through the fortress gate. Henderson's face, grey and wasted from genuine illness, disappeared beyond the archway. Within weeks, medical exchange protocols would see him aboard a ship bound for England. Home, freedom, life. The cold bit through Cram's threadbare uniform, but he barely felt it. His mind had seized on something from his pre-war study of the Geneva Convention, Article 68, Paragraph 3, medical repatriation for prisoners suffering incurable or permanently debilitating conditions. The Italians, meticulous about protocol when it suited them, honoured these exchanges under the pressure of international scrutiny. Henderson had tuberculosis, documented and undeniable, but what if the condition was manufactured? What if it could be faked so convincingly that Italian doctors had no choice but to certify it? The thought landed like a grenade in his consciousness. Progressive muscular paralysis. He had seen a case years ago during medical training at Edinburgh before switching to engineering. A young man's muscles wasting despite adequate nutrition, limbs growing weaker week by week. It was notoriously difficult to diagnose definitively and impossible to disprove without extensive testing unavailable in wartime Italy. The symptoms were observable, progressive, and, if presented correctly, terrifying to medical authorities who dreaded having such a man in their custody. Cram's hands clenched. The audacity of it staggered him. Not digging a tunnel or cutting wire, instead systematically destroying his own body until Italian doctors begged to be rid of him. Months of deliberately atrophying his muscles through calculated disuse, maintaining the charade under constant scrutiny from physicians trained to spot malingerers. The Geneva Convention protected against torture, but what he was contemplating was a self-inflicted brutality that made him physically ill to consider. The exercise period ended. Guards shouted, prisoners shuffled towards the fortress entrance, a river of olive-drab greatcoats and resignation. Cram moved with them, his mind separated from his body, racing through calculations. His engineering training took over. This was a problem of precision, with variables to control, a timeline to establish, and failure points to anticipate. The human body was a machine that could be deliberately broken down. He climbed the stone stairs to the officers' quarters, seeing the fortress with new eyes. The cell that had been his cage for 8 months was now a laboratory. The thin mattress on its iron frame, the single blanket, the wooden chair, the barred window. He assessed every object for its utility in his escape. The mattress would become his prison within a prison. The chair would be a temptation to resist. The window would frame his descent into controlled physical collapse. His cellmate, Lieutenant Davies, sat hunched over a letter from home, 6 months old, and read so many times the creases had nearly severed the paper. Davies had given up. Cram saw it in the slope of his shoulders, the mechanical way he chewed the evening's bread ration, the absence of light behind his eyes. 18 months in Gavi had broken something fundamental in Davies, who would now sit here until war's end or death, accepting captivity as fact. Cram refused that fate. At the window, he pressed his palm against the freezing stone wall, solid, ancient, built to hold. But every fortress had a weakness. Gavi's weakness was protocol. The Italians feared international condemnation more than they feared British escape attempts. A prisoner dying of documented medical collapse would trigger a diplomatic incident. The Italians would evacuate him rather than risk the stain. The calculation crystallized. Progressive muscular paralysis manifested gradually. Initial symptoms: weakness in the extremities, difficulty gripping objects, stumbling. Advanced symptoms: inability to walk, visible muscle wasting, tremors, loss of motor control. Timeline: 3 to 6 months from onset to complete debilitation. The condition was degenerative, irreversible, and utterly convincing if presented correctly. He would need to begin immediately, not with dramatic collapse, but with subtle, cumulative signs. A dropped cup here, a stumble on the stairs there, complaints of tingling fingers logged with the camp medical orderly, each symptom documented, creating a medical trail that would force the Italians to take notice. Then, once their attention was focused, the real horror would begin. Cram turned from the window. His body was strong, well-muscled, despite the prison diet. He had maintained physical fitness, refusing to let captivity weaken him. Now he would do the opposite, systematic atrophy. He would stop exercising entirely, lying motionless for hours. For days, he would let his muscles waste from deliberate disuse. The agony would be mental as much as physical. Every instinct would scream at him to move, to stretch, to resist the deterioration. He would have to override those instincts with iron discipline. The medical aspects terrified him most. Italian doctors were not fools. They had seen countless malingerers. They used standard tests for reflex, pain response, and coordination. He would need to pass every test while simultaneously exhibiting genuine physical decline. Contradiction was death to the plan. The paralysis had to appear neurological, not muscular laziness. His reflexes must remain intact even as his strength vanished. He would have to study his own body, learn to control micro-movements, and train himself to fail specific tests while passing others. Then there was the duration, months, possibly a year, lying motionless while his body consumed itself. Bed sores would develop, genuine and agonizing. His muscle mass would disappear, his cardiovascular system would deteriorate. By the time Italian doctors certified him for repatriation, he would genuinely be an invalid. The recovery period, if he survived the deception, would be brutal, but he would be recovering in England, not rotting in Gavi Fortress. The dinner bell clanged. Cram descended to the mess hall, cataloguing everything with fresh purpose. The narrow staircase where he would stage his first stumble. The refectory tables where witnesses would observe his trembling hands. The Italian medical officer, Dr. Rossini, who made weekly rounds, would be the primary target of his deception. Rossini was competent, suspicious, and an expert at identifying fakers. Convincing him would require perfection. Cram ate mechanically, the thin soup and stale bread tasteless. Around him, officers maintained a pretense of normalcy. Some played chess with pieces carved from scrap wood. Others read contraband books. A few sat silent, staring at nothing. None of them knew what he was planning, and none could. The slightest hint would trigger investigation, scrutiny, and possible isolation that would make the plan impossible. He must work alone, trust no one. The deception demanded absolute control, and other people were uncontrollable variables. A concerned friend offering help or a cellmate mentioning his strange behavior could end everything. Isolation was essential, so he would become distant and withdrawn. His manufactured personality, depressed, apathetic, resigned, would match the symptoms of his feigned illness, all of it believable in a long-term prisoner. Back in his cell, Cram sat on his bunk and removed his boots. His hands were steady. Good, that would change. In 3 weeks he would engineer a tremor during sick call. Nothing dramatic. Just enough for Dr. Rossini to note it in his records, the foundation of the medical trail. From there, symptoms would accumulate. A limp, dropped utensils, difficulty buttoning his uniform. Each incident would be witnessed and documented, building an undeniable pattern. The window showed darkness, the valley below invisible. Lying on the thin mattress, Cram knew this was his last night as a healthy man. Tomorrow the destruction would begin. He would stop exercising, moving only when necessary, and begin the systematic weakening of his body, starting with his legs. He would maintain just enough core strength to avoid arousing suspicion. Sleep would become both weapon and challenge. Too much rest would slow the atrophy, too little would make him irritable and break character. He would need to lie awake for hours, motionless, forcing his body to accept immobility. Every fiber of his being would rebel against the deliberate self-destruction. Evolution had wired him for survival. He was choosing the opposite, betting that a controlled decline would paradoxically save his life. Davies snored in the adjacent bunk, oblivious. The guards changed shift outside, boots echoing on stone. Somewhere in the fortress, a prisoner screamed during a nightmare. The normal sounds of Gavi at night. Cram listened, memorizing this moment before the point of no return. Once he began, stopping meant certain discovery. The Italians would know the previous symptoms had been theatre. They would punish him savagely, solitary confinement at minimum, possibly execution as a spy infiltrating medical repatriation systems. The stakes were absolute. Success meant England, failure meant death, but staying meant something worse. Accepting defeat, admitting that Gavi Fortress was stronger than British determination. Cram had escaped twice before in North Africa, recaptured both times but never broken. He would not start now. If the Italians wanted to keep him, they would have to watch him waste away, then take responsibility for his corpse. He closed his eyes. 3 to 6 months of hell, then medical certification, then the slow processing of repatriation paperwork, transport to a hospital ship, and finally home. The timeline stretched before him like a minefield where any misstep could detonate the whole operation, but the alternative was sitting in this cell until 1945 or 1946, waiting for Allied victory while his youth and strength drained away into meaningless captivity. The decision had been made the moment Henderson disappeared through that gate. Cram was simply acknowledging it. Tomorrow the transformation would begin. Lieutenant Alastair Cram, healthy British officer, would start his metamorphosis into a wasting invalid. The escape attempt was no longer theoretical, it was inevitable. The only question remaining was whether he possessed the horrifying discipline to see it through. The actor's ordeal. Spring 1943, Gavi Fortress. The performance began with a staged fall and a claimed back injury. From that day, Lieutenant Alastair Cram confined himself to his bunk. He forced his body into stillness, deliberately refusing to use his leg muscles. Day by day, week by week, the athletic officer began to waste away. His legs, starved of use, grew thin and weak. He practiced the symptoms of his feigned illness with a method actor's precision, the tremors, the dead weight of his limbs, the impassive face when doctors tested his reflexes with sharp pins. His few fellow officers sworn to secrecy aided the charade, carrying him to the latrine and washroom. Cram was waging a war not against stone walls, but against his own body's desperate will to be healthy, turning his bunk into a stage for the most convincing performance of his life. The plan had formed during weeks of observation from his cell window. The route was clear. Feign complete physical collapse to convince the Italian medical staff his condition required hospitalization. The goal was a transfer to a civilian facility with weaker security, creating an opportunity to escape. Simple in concept, it was brutal in execution. The method demanded Cram destroy his own physical condition so thoroughly that even trained doctors would see no alternative but evacuation. It exploited a single weakness in the fortress system. Medical cases requiring specialized treatment had to be transferred out. The timing was critical. Too fast, and the symptoms would seem suspicious. Too slow, and his body might suffer permanent damage. He gave himself 12 weeks to become a medical emergency. Recruiting help required absolute trust. Captain Dick Carr was first, a bond forged in the chaos of Tobruk. Cram approached him during a rare exercise period, speaking low while other prisoners created a distraction. "I need you to carry me to the latrine twice a day, for months. No questions asked publicly. Can you do it?" Carr studied Cram's face, understanding this was calculation, not madness. He nodded once. One ally. Major John de Burgh, recruited through Carr, came next. De Burgh had pre-war medical training, enough to know what symptoms Cram needed to mimic and what tests the Italian doctors would perform. He could advise the performance without killing the actor. The risk was staggering, but de Burgh possessed a steadiness under pressure that Cram needed. Lieutenant Tony Davies, strong enough to carry Cram and bitter enough about captivity to commit, completed the inner circle. 3 men, no more. Too many conspirators courted betrayal from the fortress's network of informers, men broken by captivity who would sell anyone for an extra ration. The physical destruction began immediately. Cram lay in his bunk, forcing every muscle to remain slack as his powerful legs screamed for movement. He ignored them. When guards weren't watching, he practiced the tremor, a slight involuntary shaking suggesting neurological damage. De Burgh coached him in whispers at night. Parkinson's shows intermittent tremor, worse with stress. Spinal injury causes different patterns. Mix them. Keep the doctors guessing. Cram refined the performance hour by hour. Morning roll call required Carr and Davies to lift him upright, his legs dangling uselessly. He kept his face blank, drool sometimes escaping his mouth as guards watched with disgust and suspicion. Days became weeks. His legs began to genuinely atrophy, muscle wasting from disuse. The pain was constant, a deep ache in his bones, surprise cramps, and the psychological torment of forced immobility. He lost weight rapidly on already inadequate rations. Lying motionless, his body consumed itself. His cheeks hollowed. The athletic officer was replaced by a wasted figure whose legs had shrunk to half their size. The Italian doctors came weekly at first, then more frequently. They were competent physicians, not fools. Dr. Ricciardi, a precise neurologist from Milan, led the examinations. He tested Cram's reflexes with a small hammer, tapping below the knee. Cram had practiced this, letting his legs swing slightly, but with the weak force of damaged nerves. Ricciardi frowned. He inserted pins into Cram's legs, shallow punctures that should have produced a flinch. Cram stared at the ceiling, face impassive, mentally counting stones to block out the pain as the steel bit his skin. Ricciardi spoke rapid Italian to his assistant, noting his observations. Diminished sensation bilateral lower extremities, muscle atrophy consistent with prolonged immobility, possible spinal lesion. The diagnosis was forming. Cram knew he needed to push harder. Week 6 brought a close call. A new younger doctor arrived. Dr. Fontana, who had worked in a psychiatric hospital, was suspicious. He watched Cram differently, not examining the body, but studying the performance. He came unannounced one afternoon, entering the cell while Cram was secretly performing minimal leg exercises to prevent permanent atrophy. Hearing Fontana's boots on the stone, Cram had 2 seconds. He dropped his legs, forced his face into the slack mask, and began the tremor. Fontana stood in the doorway, eyes narrow. "I forgot something," he said in careful English. He stepped closer, watching for any flicker of awareness. Cram's heart hammered, but his face remained dead, eyes unfocused. Fontana leaned in and spoke directly into his ear. "If you are pretending, I will discover it, and you will face consequences far worse than this cell." Still, Cram showed nothing. Fontana straightened, made a note, and left. Cram remained frozen for 10 more minutes. That evening, Carr brought water. Fontana asked questions. He whispered. "About your mental state before the fall, whether you seemed depressed." The net was tightening. They were looking for deception. Week 8 brought a physical crisis. Cram's legs had atrophied so severely that genuine neurological symptoms appeared, pins and needles, and real difficulty controlling certain muscles. "You've gone too far," de Burgh warned after a brief examination, pressing fingers into the wasted muscle. "Another month and you might not recover." Cram's voice was a rusty whisper. "No choice. Fontana watches constantly." The psychological toll mounted. Genuine depression crept in. The isolation and the constant performance broke something inside him. He caught himself forgetting to act, the tremor becoming natural. He was becoming what he pretended to be. Carr saw the change in his eyes. "Come back," he whispered, while lowering Cram onto his bunk. "Don't lose yourself in this." The line between performance and reality was dissolving. Week 10 delivered the breakthrough. Dr. Ricciardi arrived with senior medical staff from the Italian command. After extensive examinations, Cram heard fragments of their consultation through the door. Progressive paralysis. Cannot determine cause. Specialized diagnostic equipment required. Recommend transfer. The hook was set. Now came the delicate final phase. Cram carefully added new symptoms: occasional loss of bladder control, difficulty swallowing, and slurred speech, all suggesting intermittent neurological damage. Ricciardi documented everything, building a case for evacuation. The fortress commandant resisted, as every transfer from Gavi was suspicious, but medical authority carried weight. Ricciardi pressed, warning that a death in custody would require an explanation to higher command and a potential Red Cross investigation. Bureaucratic pressure won. Week 12 arrived. The spring sunshine felt alien on skin that had known only cold stone for 3 months. He was a skeletal figure, 40 pounds lighter, his face gaunt. The tremor was now so ingrained he sometimes couldn't stop it. He had transformed his body into a medical emergency. The orders came on April 15th. Transfer to a civilian hospital in Padua for specialized evaluation. 2 guards would accompany him. Security would be local carabinieri, not fortress troops. The window was opening, but Cram faced a new terror. His body was so weak that escape might be physically impossible. 3 months of atrophy meant he could barely stand, let alone run or climb. The plan now required recovery time in the hospital, secretly rebuilding just enough strength to flee. Final preparations were made in whispers. Carr slipped him a tiny compass hidden in a bar of soap. Davies provided a memorized map of northern Italy. De Berg gave his final medical advice. In hospital, eat everything, move your legs under the sheets, rebuild just enough strength to walk a few kilometers, but keep the tremor, keep the confusion until the moment you run. They couldn't provide escape tools or money. Cram would arrive with only his wasted body and the performance that had nearly cost his sanity. The night before, his co-conspirators and a few trusted officers offered silent farewells, brief grips of the hand, acknowledging he might not be seen again. April the 16th, 1943. Dawn broke cold and grey. Guards entered with a stretcher and loaded him like cargo, strapping him down. In the courtyard, the stone walls seemed impossibly high. From their windows, prisoners watched in silence as Cram was carried towards the gates of Gavi Fortress. For the first time in 18 months, he passed beyond them. In the ambulance, 2 guards sat with rifles, watching their prisoner with bored suspicion. The engine started. Cram lay strapped down, maintaining the tremor, but his eyes, when the guards weren't looking, focused on the road ahead. North toward Padua, toward a hospital where security would depend on his apparent helplessness. 3 months of systematic self-destruction had led to this moment. His legs were useless, his body wasted, his mind frayed, but he was moving. The guards talked quietly in Italian, ignoring the seemingly broken officer between them. They saw what Cram had spent 12 weeks creating, a helpless invalid, no threat. What they couldn't see was the compass in the soap, the memorized map, and the steel will that had endured deliberate paralysis for this single opportunity. The ambulance rolled north through the green spring countryside. The escape had not truly begun, but the performance had brought him this far. Now came the harder part, recovery without discovery, and the hope that when the moment arrived, his wasted legs could carry him to freedom. Chapter 5. The Doctor's Inquisition. Summer 1943, Gavi Fortress Infirmary. The Italian doctors were suspicious. They put Lieutenant Alastair Cram through a series of painful and humiliating tests, searching for the slightest sign of deception. They used electroshock therapy, hoping an involuntary muscle spasm would expose him. Cram, anticipating this, had trained himself to withstand the shocks without flinching. The electrodes pressed cold against his temples, the current surging through his skull. Every nerve screamed to react, to show the pain tearing through him, but he forced his face into blank neutrality. His jaw remained slack, his eyes staring forward, unfocused. The Italian physician increased the voltage. Cram's vision whited out. His teeth wanted to clench, but he kept them loose as drool ran down his chin. The doctor watched for the telltale muscle contraction that would prove conscious control. Cram gave him nothing. The session lasted 40 minutes. When they disconnected the electrodes, Cram's head pounded with a migraine that would last 3 days. He had not moved a single voluntary muscle. The Italians documented the results. No response to painful stimuli, possible genuine paralysis, but suspicion remained in their eyes. They tried other approaches. Ice water immersion failed to shock his system into reaction. Though his body temperature dropped dangerously, his lips turned blue and his breathing grew shallow. His legs remained motionless in the freezing bath. They pricked his feet with needles, drawing blood. Nothing. They burned his soles with cigarettes, the smell of his own flesh scorching the examination room. Cram stared at the ceiling, his face a mask of vacant helplessness, even as the pain threatened to shatter his sanity. The lead physician, Dr. Rossini, became personally invested in breaking him. He subjected Cram to humiliating physical examinations, probing for any sign of muscle tone, and measured his legs obsessively, documenting the progressive atrophy. The measurements were damning in an unexpected way. Cram's muscles were genuinely wasting. After 15 months of complete immobility, the flesh had melted from his bones. What began as performance had become horrifying reality. His thighs had lost 8 centimeters in circumference. His calves were skeletal. Even Rossini, convinced Cram was malingering, could not explain away the physical evidence. No man could maintain such discipline. July 1943 brought new torments. They injected substances into his spine, searching for reflex responses that conscious control could not suppress. The spinal taps left Cram with blinding headaches and nausea. They positioned him in stress positions, his paralyzed legs at unnatural angles, waiting for him to adjust them. He endured 6-hour sessions without moving, even as his hip joints screamed in agony. The Italians photographed everything, building a medical file that grew thicker by the week. Specialists from Rome were brought in. A neurologist performed deep tendon reflex tests, striking Cram's knees and ankles with rubber hammers to no response. An orthopedic surgeon examined his spine, finding no injury that might explain the paralysis. The verdict remained inconclusive. Either Cram was the most disciplined malingerer in medical history, or something had genuinely destroyed his motor function. They could not prove which. In August, the staff began leaving him in deliberately uncomfortable positions, hoping he would adjust himself when unobserved. Cram anticipated this. He remained in whatever position they placed him, even when it cut off circulation or left him staring at a blank wall for 8 hours. Orderlies checked on him at random intervals, but never caught him moving. One night, they positioned him with his head tilted at an angle that made breathing difficult. Cram maintained the position until morning, spending the night in shallow, painful breaths, his neck cramping, refusing to give them the satisfaction of catching him. When they found him in the morning, exactly as positioned, even the most skeptical orderly crossed himself. No man could endure this. When Italy capitulated in September 1943, everything changed. The Germans took over Gavi Fortress. Wehrmacht soldiers replaced the Italians, harder men who viewed the prisoners with cold efficiency. Within a week, German doctors arrived. They had fought the British in North Africa and Greece in brutal campaigns where deception was a matter of survival. They did not believe in British paralysis, they believed in British cunning. The new chief medical officer, Stabsarzt Schneider, reviewed Cram's file with open contempt. 15 months of claimed paralysis with no physical injury, convenient symptoms that made him unfit for transfer to Germany, and inconclusive tests. Schneider made his assessment immediately. This was a fraud, and he would prove it. The German examinations made the Italian tests seem gentle. Schneider began with methodical torture, using electrical stimulation on Cram's feet at higher voltages than the Italians dared employ. The current burned through his soles, creating blisters that would take weeks to heal, yet Cram's face remained slack. Schneider increased the voltage until the smell of burning flesh became overpowering. Still nothing. No flinch, no pulled muscle, no sign of voluntary control. The German noted, "Subject shows either complete paralysis or unprecedented pain tolerance." They subjected him to prolonged ice therapy, packing his lower body in ice for 4-hour sessions. His core temperature dropped to dangerous levels and his kidneys began to fail. The camp commandant suggested they might actually kill him. Schneider was unconcerned. If the paralysis is real, he cannot feel the ice. If it is fake, he will break. Either way, we will know. Cram shivered uncontrollably, his upper body convulsing with cold, while his lower half remained perfectly still. The Germans documented this as suspicious. Why did the paralysis allow shivering above the waist but not below? They subjected him to 3 more ice sessions. By October, Schneider's frustration was palpable. He began spinal tap procedures, more brutal than the Italian versions, with thicker needles inserted with less care. They extracted fluid and injected irritants, watching for any sign of response. Cram endured each procedure in silence, his face a vacant mask. The resulting headaches left him vomiting, yet even then he kept his legs motionless. The orderlies had to clean him like an infant. The humiliation was part of the test. They watched to see if shame would break his discipline. It did not. They escalated. Schneider designed stress positions specifically calculated to be unbearable, bending Cram's legs at 90-degree angles and tying them in place. The position cut off blood flow. Within an hour, the pain in his hips became excruciating. After 3 hours, he could feel his joints beginning to separate. After 6, he was certain his pelvis would dislocate. He did not move. He did not speak. He stared at nothing, a broken man in a broken body, while German physicians took notes. When they finally released him after 9 hours, his legs were purple from restricted circulation. Schneider examined the damage with clinical interest. The tissue death was real, the suffering was genuine, but was the paralysis? November brought a new approach, leaving him unattended for days, observed through hidden holes in the infirmary walls. Cram knew they were watching. For 72 hours, he lay exactly as positioned, staring at the ceiling, moving only his arms and head for necessary functions. When they retrieved him, his back had developed pressure sores. The sores became infected, and the infection nearly killed him. German doctors treated the sepsis with grudging efficiency. A dead prisoner proved nothing. A broken one confessed everything. December's winter cold penetrated the stone walls of the fortress. Cram's emaciated body could not generate warmth. Frostbite became a real concern. The Germans provided minimal blankets, watching to see if he would move. He did not. His toes turned black. A German surgeon recommended amputation. Schneider delayed. Let the British fraud face the consequences. If Cram was faking, he would abandon the charade rather than lose his toes. The frostbite worsened. Cram watched his own feet dying, knowing gangrene might follow, and still did not move. The surgeon intervened, defying Schneider, and treated the frostbite aggressively. 3 toes were saved by millimeters. Schneider intensified the psychological warfare, bringing in other prisoners to interrogate in Cram's presence. He told Cram his fellow officers had been tortured because of his deception, showing him photographs of men beaten bloody. It was unclear if they were real or staged. Cram's face showed nothing. Inside, guilt tore at him, but to react was to prove mental competence. A truly paralyzed man would be disconnected, lost in his own damaged mind. Cram retreated into that performance, his eyes glazed, showing no recognition. Schneider abandoned the approach. The officer was either genuinely brain damaged or utterly without conscience. In January 1944, Schneider made his final attempt. He brought in an SS doctor, Hauptsturmführer Koch, a specialist in interrogation and torture. Koch designed a test of exquisite cruelty, suspending Cram's legs in traction with weights calculated to slowly dislocate his hips. If the paralysis was real, he would feel nothing. If fake, the pain would break him. The weights pulled at Cram's femurs with inexorable force. His hip sockets began to separate. The pain was deep, structural, the feeling of his body being pulled apart. He made his mind distant, imagining himself elsewhere. 4 hours in, Koch increased the weights. Cram felt something tear inside his right hip. The pain spiked to levels that defied description, his vision tunneling. Unconsciousness beckoned, but he forced himself to remain awake, maintaining the blank expression. Koch watched. Most men would be screaming. This one did not whimper. After 6 hours, Koch removed the traction. Cram's hips were partially dislocated. The SS doctor made his report to Schneider. Either the officer had damaged himself beyond repair to maintain his deception, or the paralysis was genuine. Either way, he was a medical liability, no longer fit for interrogation. Koch recommended reclassification as permanently disabled. By February 1944, Cram lay in his infirmary bed, his body genuinely broken. The line between performance and reality had vanished. His legs were skeletal, the muscles so atrophied they might never recover. His hips were damaged, his feet scarred, his spine showing trauma from repeated taps. The medical file was hundreds of pages thick, documenting every stage of his deterioration. He had transformed himself from a healthy young officer into a crippled wreck through sheer willpower. Schneider made his final assessment. He had failed to break Cram. The evidence was overwhelming. He documented his conclusion: recommendation for transfer to a medical facility, classification as disabled prisoner. But Allied bombing made transport problematic. Cram remained at Gavi, trapped in the body he had deliberately destroyed, waiting for an opportunity that might never come. The doctors watched him still, suspicious, resentful, unable to prove what they felt must be true. The British officer was deceiving them, but they could not break him, and something about that failure filled them with a reluctant, unwilling respect. No man should be capable of this, but somehow, impossibly, Alastair Cram had become capable of anything. Chapter 6. The Final Curtain. Early 1944 Germany. After more than a year of his self-imposed paralysis, Lieutenant Alastair Cram had become so convincing that the German Medical Board could no longer justify keeping him. He was a useless, broken specimen taking up a valuable hospital bed. They reluctantly approved him for medical repatriation. Placed on a stretcher and carried onto a Red Cross train, he began the long journey across the Third Reich towards freedom. Even then, he dared not break character. He remained limp and unresponsive, surrounded by enemy soldiers, until the train finally crossed into Allied-held territory. Only then did he allow himself to move. The long con was over. He had escaped not by breaking out, but by breaking himself. He was free, but the road back to health, both physical and mental, would be as arduous as the deception itself. The Red Cross train rocks gently through the German countryside. Cram lies on his stretcher, muscles screaming from forced stillness, sweat beading despite the February cold. 14 months of self-imposed paralysis have genuinely compromised his body. The muscles he once commanded now resist. In private darkness, his limbs shake when he attempts to move them. But he cannot move them now, not yet. German orderlies and Swiss Red Cross officials patrol the carriage. One wrong twitch and the deception collapses. They would drag him off this train, return him to the camp, and the punishment for such an elaborate fraud would be beyond imagination. The train stops at Frankfurt. Cold air floods the carriage. Cram's eyes remain fixed upward, unblinking, seeing nothing. Guards board, walking between stretchers, studying faces. looking for malingerers. As the war turns against Germany, inspections have become brutal and thorough. Every repatriation is questioned, every diagnosis verified again. One guard stops at Cram's stretcher, standing over him. Cram feels the man's scrutiny, keeps his breathing shallow, his eyes dead. The guard grunts and moves on. The doors close and the train lurches forward, but Cram's heart hammers against his ribs. Hours still remain. The border is a distant promise. As the train moves west, the landscape changes to bombed cities and shattered factories. The Third Reich is collapsing, but remains dangerous, still capable of violence against those who deceive it. Cram tracks the journey through sounds and vibrations, having memorized the westbound route from maps. For miles, German soldiers walk past his stretcher, guards check papers, and the possibility of discovery hangs over every second. Night falls and the carriage darkens. Cram lies rigid, permanent pain etched into his back. Bed sores that never properly healed ache beneath bandages. His legs have atrophied to the thickness of a boy's arms. The muscle wastage is no longer performance, but consequence. He has broken his body to sell the lie. Whether he can rebuild it is uncertain. First, he must survive this journey. The train stops again. Sharp German commands echo from outside, heralding a more thorough inspection. An SS officer boards. The click of his boots on the carriage floor, more precise, more dangerous than the Wehrmacht guards. The SS man questions the Red Cross officials, demanding documentation for every patient. He works his way down the carriage, stretcher by stretcher. When he reaches Cram, he speaks directly to the Swiss official, demanding the diagnosis. The official reads from the file: progressive paralysis, multiple examinations, German Medical Board approval. Unsatisfied, the SS man leans over Cram's face, his breath smelling of cigarettes and coffee. He lifts Cram's eyelid roughly and shines a light directly into his pupil. Cram keeps the eye unfocused, dead. The involuntary flinch he has trained away through months of practice does not occur. The officer drops the eyelid and takes Cram's wrist, feeling for a pulse. Cram cannot control his racing heart, but the officer seems to expect an elevated pulse in an invalid. He drops the wrist, straightens up, and speaks again in rapid German. The moment stretches. The officer could order Cram removed for further verification, seeing through 14 months of deception with a single command. The Swiss official's voice remains calm, professional. He reiterates that multiple German doctors confirmed the diagnosis and the repatriation is legitimate under the Geneva Convention. The SS officer stares at Cram one more time, then moves to the next stretcher. Cram allows himself no relief. The border still lies ahead. Dawn breaks as the train approaches the French frontier. Cram has not slept. His body trembles from exhaustion, but he channels it into the palsy he has mimicked for so long, using his genuine suffering to sell the lie. The train slows at the German border post, the critical point. Cram knows the stories of prisoners approved for exchange who were pulled off trains here, last-minute denials before the Germans lost their hold. Guards board in force, methodical and thorough, checking every face against photographs, every patient against records. Two guards stop at Cram's stretcher and argue in German. One thinks something is wrong. This one looks too young to be so damaged. The other says the papers are in order, pointing to the signatures of 3 German doctors. Unconvinced, the first guard grabs Cram's arm, lifts it, and lets it drop. The arm falls like dead weight. 14 months of practice make it perfect. He tries the other arm with the same result. He lifts Cram's leg, bending it. No resistance, no muscle control. The guard probes harder, twisting the leg roughly. Pain shoots through Cram's hip, but he shows nothing. No flinch, no change in breathing. The dead eyes stare upward. With a grunt of disgust, the guard releases the leg and they move on. The train sits at the border post for 3 hours while every patient is examined. Cram lies in his own sweat, the stress pushing him to new limits. He focuses on a water stain on the ceiling, becomes the stain, becomes nothing. Finally, the train lurches forward, crossing into Vichy, France. This is not yet safety. The Gestapo operates here. The long stillness has created new bed sores. His throat is raw from controlled breathing, and dehydration makes his head pound. But he cannot ask for water. The train continues west, passing through Lyon and turning south towards Switzerland. Night falls as the train approaches the demarcation line. Beyond it lies Switzerland, then Britain. Freedom. The train stops, and voices outside mix German, French, Swiss, and English. Hearing his own language makes Cram's heart surge, but he crushes the reaction. Officials board, German officers for final checks, Swiss officials for verification, and British medical staff to receive their wounded. A British doctor stops at his stretcher, reading the file as a German officer summarizes the case. The British doctor examines Cram, gentle where the Germans were rough. So close to safety, a final question could still undo everything. The German officer asks if the British accept the transfer. The doctor says yes, paperwork is stamped, the Germans disembark, and the doors close. The train moves forward into Switzerland. The journey continues, but the fear remains. A British nurse stops at his stretcher, speaking softly. "You're safe now, we'll get you home." Cram wants to respond, but 14 months of caution prevent it. What if this is a test? He remains silent, unmoving. Hours later, the train reaches the free French zone. Allied flags fly. An officer stops at his stretcher, reads his name and diagnosis, and shakes his head sadly. "England awaits, Lieutenant. You'll receive the best care." Cram hears the words but cannot acknowledge them. The reflex of concealment is too deep to be switched off by a border crossing. The nurse returns, checking his vital signs, noting his elevated heart rate. "The stress is over," she says soothingly, not understanding that for Cram, safety is a state he cannot yet access. The train reaches Calais. Stretchers are carried onto a hospital ship waiting in the harbour. Surrounded by English voices, officers, nurses, sailors, Cram feels the cold sea air as the ship casts off, heading for England, for home. Still, he does not move. The paralysis holds. The ship docks at Dover. The white cliffs are visible through a porthole. England, British soil. He is carried into an ambulance and driven to a military hospital in Sussex. Transferred to a ward with clean white sheets and British nurses, he is told he is safe. Still, he cannot move. The fear has become reflex. The performance has consumed the performer. That evening, a doctor examines him, reviews the German files, finds no responses, and discusses long-term care with colleagues. Cram hears their compassion, their belief in his condition. His lie has become their truth. Night comes to the hospital. The ward is dark and silent, save for the breathing of sleeping patients. Cram lies awake, staring at the ceiling. He is in England, in a British military hospital, surrounded by his own people. The rational part of his mind knows he is safe, that he can stop the act. But his body will not obey. The paralysis holds. Hours pass. Then slowly, carefully, he attempts to move his right hand. The fingers twitch, a movement so slight it might be imagined. He tries again. The fingers curl slightly, then straighten, the hand shaking with effort. Muscles that have not moved in 14 months resist. Atrophy fights against will, but the movement is real. He moves one finger at a time, then the whole hand. He tries the arm. It lifts an inch off the bed and drops back. He is weak, genuinely damaged by the deception. He tries his legs. They respond, but barely. The muscles have wasted away. He can move them, but not control them. He has escaped through paralysis, but achieved partial paralysis in the process. A night nurse on her rounds checks him. He freezes, the old habit taking over. She adjusts his blanket and moves on. When she's gone, he tries again, moving his hand, his arm, proving to himself that he is free. The long con has succeeded. He has escaped, by convincing everyone, including his own body, that he was broken. But lying there in the dark ward, Cram realizes his escape is only beginning. He has traded one prison for another. The months of absolute discipline have created patterns that will take months more to break. He can move his fingers now. Walking again may take a year. He has won his freedom, but the price is calculated in flesh and nerve. Lying there, he moves his hand slowly in the darkness, reclaiming his body inch by inch. The escape is complete. The recovery has just begun. Chapter 7. The Price of Freedom, post-1944. Alastair Cram returned to Britain not as a triumphant hero, but as a skeletal invalid whose very existence was a medical curiosity. The military doctors at the repatriation center in Naples, men accustomed to the grim realities of war, took one look at his emaciated frame and immediately admitted him to the hospital ward, bypassing standard procedure. He weighed a mere 93 pounds. His legs, which for 18 excruciating months had been deliberately and methodically starved of muscle and mass, could barely support his own negligible weight. The first time he attempted to stand unaided by his bedside, his atrophied limbs gave way and he collapsed in a heap. A quick-acting nurse caught him just before his head struck the unforgiving tile floor. The road to recovery began the very next day with a grueling physiotherapy regimen. The exercises were deceptively simple, lifting his leg 6 inches off the bed, holding it steady for a count of 5. Yet, by the 3rd repetition, his entire body trembled violently with the sheer effort, sweat beading on his pallid brow. The medical staff were not strangers to starvation cases. They had seen countless liberated prisoners from German camps across Italy, bodies ravaged by neglect and cruelty. But Cram's case was profoundly different, unsettlingly so. The atrophy was too symmetrical, the deterioration too methodical, as if orchestrated. It was a deliberate, controlled demolition of a human body. One senior doctor, meticulously reviewing his charts, voiced the question that hung in the air. What kind of prisoner intentionally destroys his own body? The answer to that question was what the officers from MI9, Britain's Military Intelligence Escape and Evasion Directorate, had come to learn. Cram's debriefing lasted 3 intense days. They probed for every detail: the meticulously feigned illness, the subtle diet manipulation, the carefully managed physical deterioration timeline that had fooled Italian and German doctors alike. His information possessed immediate and significant intelligence value. The layout of the Italian hospital he had memorized, the names of potentially sympathetic guards, the floor plans of other prison facilities mentioned by transferred patients, all of it was meticulously documented, sent into reports marked secret, and filed away in the deepest archives in London. But what truly fascinated the seasoned MI9 analysts was the psychological dimension of his escape. For 18 months, Cram had maintained an absolute unbreakable discipline while actively observing his own body waste away. There was no wavering, no panic, no breaking character, not even when his heart rate plummeted to a perilous 40 beats per minute, and concerned doctors warned him he was approaching catastrophic organ failure. He had inhabited the role of a dying man so completely that he had nearly made it a reality. The official MI9 summary noted, subject demonstrated an unprecedented ability to compartmentalize immense physical distress in service of a long-term escape objective. Recommend his case be studied for inclusion in advanced resistance training protocols. In a quiet, unpublicized ceremony at the hospital, he was awarded the Military Cross. The official citation mentioned his gallant and distinguished services in escaping and evading the enemy, but deliberately omitted the horrifying method. The security classification remained firmly in effect. His family was informed that he had been repatriated. They learned he had successfully escaped. They would never learn the full harrowing details of how he had done it. When Cram finally returned to his home in Edinburgh in the early months of 1945, He weighed a fragile 120 pounds and walked with the assistance of a cane. He re-enrolled in his architectural studies, attempting to behave as if the previous 4 years had been a mere interruption rather than a fundamental transformation of his very being. Classmates who knew he had been a prisoner of war would occasionally ask about his experiences, but he deflected their questions with a practiced, disarming ease. The true toll remained locked away. The nightmares, vivid and terrifying, he kept private. The way his hand would begin to shake uncontrollably if he felt too full after a meal, a phantom sensation of his past starvation, he kept private. The visceral terror that gripped him in sterile hospital waiting rooms, surrounded by the triggering smell of antiseptic and the sound of Italian voices on the wireless, he kept private. Post-war Britain, weary and seeking narratives of straightforward heroism, had little appetite for the more disturbing and morally ambiguous stories of captivity. The Great Escape from Stalag Luft III, with its martyred officers and Hollywood-ready tunnel drama, captured the public imagination. Colditz Castle, with its litany of dashing escape attempts and aristocratic intrigue, became the stuff of bestsellers and legends. Cram's story, the story of a man who had turned starvation into a weapon, who had made his own body a grim battleground, was too unsettling, too visceral, too uncomfortably self-destructive for popular consumption. He understood this instinctively. In 1954, he penned his memoir under the pseudonym Ian English. The book, titled The Sign of the Scythe, appeared in a small print run from a specialist military publisher. Reviews were respectful, but sparse. The book sold modestly and went out of print within 3 years. Cram never promoted it, never gave interviews, and never sought any form of recognition for his ordeal. He married, established a successful architectural practice in Edinburgh, and lived a quiet, outwardly unremarkable and productive life. The story faded into obscurity. Fellow prisoners from Campo 21 who had witnessed his shocking transformation remembered, of course. They had watched him waste away, heard the whispers and rumours about a feigned illness, and seen him carried out on a stretcher, a living skeleton. But even they did not know the full extent of the deception until decades later, if they learned it at all. The Italian doctors who had treated him retired or passed away, their meticulous patient records filed away and forgotten in dusty hospital basements. The MI9 debriefing remained classified secret, locked in the inaccessible archives of the Ministry of Defence. By 1960, Alastair Cram's extraordinary escape was known to perhaps 50 people in the world. The forgetting was systematic and almost complete. Then, in 1983, a military historian named Barbara Bond commenced her research on MI9's escape and evasion operations for her doctoral thesis at King's College London. She submitted a series of Freedom of Information requests for declassified wartime intelligence files. In response, the Ministry of Defence released 12 boxes of material, including debriefing summaries from repatriated POWs. In Box 7, amidst a trove of forgotten histories, she found a file labelled Cram, Alastair, Campo 21, Medical Deception Escape, 1944. She had to read it twice before its incredible contents could be fully absorbed. The 18-month timeline, the calculated starvation, the manipulation of medical professionals, the near-death deterioration, the successful repatriation, and the audacious subsequent escape from the hospital train. Cross-referencing the file number, she found a small notation. See also, English, Ian, The Sign of the Scythe, 1954. 3 weeks of exhaustive searching finally located a rare copy in the Imperial War Museum Library. Reading Cram's pseudonymous account alongside the stark clinical language of the declassified debriefing, Bond realized she had stumbled onto one of the most extreme and courageous escape stories of the entire war, a story that almost no one knew existed. Her dissertation included a detailed chapter on Cram's case. Her subsequent book, The Art of Evasion, MI9's Secret War, published in 1989, brought the story to a wider audience for the very first time. By then, Cram had been dead for 3 years. He had passed away quietly in 1986 at age 71. His obituary in The Scotsman mentioning his distinguished wartime service and successful architectural career, but making no reference whatsoever to his unique escape. Bond contacted his widow, who graciously confirmed the details and provided additional, invaluable context. Mrs. Cram had known the broad outline of the story. Her husband had been more forthcoming with her than with the public. But even she had not fully grasped the profound medical danger he had courted until she read his classified debriefing decades after the events themselves. The rediscovery of Cram's story accelerated through the 1990s and into the new millennium. Military survival schools, particularly the Joint Services Intelligence Organization's Conduct After Capture training program, began incorporating his case into their curricula. It was not presented as an example to emulate. The self-starvation method was explicitly discouraged as far too dangerous and unpredictable, but as a powerful case study in psychological endurance and advanced deception. Instructors used it to illustrate the absolute outer limits of human resistance, the precarious point where determination crosses into self-destruction, and the critical necessity of maintaining some anchor to survival even while executing a desperate escape plan. The lesson wasn't starve yourself to escape. The lesson was understand the immense psychological cost of sustained deception under captivity and know your own breaking points before you reach them. At the Defence Intelligence and Security Centre in Chicksands, Bedfordshire, Cram's debriefing became required reading for officers being trained in resistance to interrogation. His case perfectly illustrated a principle now embedded in British military doctrine. The captor's perception of a prisoner's medical state can be decisively manipulated, but only if the prisoner maintains absolute, unwavering consistency in the deception. Cram had never broken character. Not once in 18 months. The instructors emphasized this point relentlessly. His success depended not on the act of starvation itself, but on his unwavering commitment to the role of a dying man. One lapse, one moment of normal energy or unguarded appetite, and the entire 18-month deception would have collapsed. By 2000, Alastair Cram's story had entered the institutional memory of British military intelligence and survival training. The Sign of the Scythe was reprinted in 2003 with a new introduction explaining the pseudonym and confirming the author's identity. The book found a new, appreciative audience among military historians, special operations personnel, and students of human psychology. His name began to appear in exhibitions at the Imperial War Museum and the National Army Museum. Today, at the Tri-Service Conduct After Capture training facility, instructors reference Cram's case in the module on medical deception. They show students the declassified debriefing, the faked hospital records, and the shocking timeline of his deterioration. Then they show them the physiotherapy reports from after his repatriation, the months of arduous recovery, the documented long-term health consequences. The message is stark and unambiguous. This worked, this man escaped, but it nearly killed him. The cost was permanent. He lived with the consequences for the rest of his life. The nightmares never fully stopped. His relationship with food remained complicated and fraught until his death. The psychological scars from 18 months of self-inflicted suffering ran unimaginably deep. He never regretted his choice, his widow confirmed, but he never recommended it to anyone either. Alastair Cram's grave is in Dean Cemetery in Edinburgh, a simple headstone with his name, dates, and military rank. There is no mention of Campo 21, no reference to his singular escape, but his other, more secret legacy thrives in the classified briefing rooms and survival school classrooms where his story is still told, still studied, and still debated. It is no longer forgotten, but remembered carefully, with the full, sobering weight of what he endured and the price he paid. A lasting reminder that courage and self-destruction can sometimes wear the same face, and the line between them is drawn in blood, willpower, and the terrifying capacity of a human being to endure what should not be endurable for the priceless prize of freedom.